Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. Yeah, I just want to say thank you very much, Paula. I worked directly with Paula over the 3 months of the fellowship, and her enthusiasm and her knowledge about the collection was really infectious. It was kind of a delight to come in here and just have a chance to kind of work with you and be in the stacks and look at the collection that Graham Brown had built up. I mean, it's truly, it's a real, again, just to say privilege is an understatement. What he built up over all those years, especially with his Alpine collections, is, yeah, could we extend the fellowship for another couple of years? Yes, today I'd just like to talk about my time with the fellowship and what I hope to publish by the end of it. I am a self-confessed lover of mountains, an obsessive perhaps, and I think that's shown through. I probably drove Paula mad during the course of this. But my background's perhaps slightly different to a lot of people who are interested in mountains, and I'll go through that over the course of this talk and just sort of lay out my own approach to the collection and what I kind of hope to achieve by the end of it. And I thought I'd start with this image of the Isle of Arran towards my favourite mountain, Kirvor, on the right, and Goatfell there on the left. So if anyone was wondering where that's from, that's by my estimation one of the best views in Scotland. Feel free to disagree with me. So I just want to maybe talk through some of my credentials, why I'm interested in mountaineering. And I was born in Germany, and I'm sure you can tell from my accent. But this was the first ever mountain I went up. It was a small expedition led by my father. And yeah, in the Alps, in the Allgäuer Alpen. And this is Fellhorn. Yeah, at 2,000 meters, it's slightly higher than what we have here in Scotland. And my memories of that day, you know, to have that kind of early experience in your life, you know, going so high and to have that kind of, actually, truthfully, I can't remember anything. I was 4 years old. And there's a ski lift on the back of it. But I thought I'd try and impress you from the start. And so yeah, actually, my actual memories of mountains are slightly more prosaic from the beginning. They were really here in Scotland, but it was with my father. But yes, I want to talk today about 100 mountains, or 100 famous mountains of Japan, which was sort of the basis of my interest. And this is a book I was given several years ago as a gift. And it sort of gave me a different way into viewing and understanding our mountains and what makes them special and what kind of drives our enthusiasm about it, because I'm sure everyone here is obsessed with as mountains as I am. But yes, Kiyo Fukada published this book in the 1960s, and the book actually originally appeared as a series of articles. He would pick a mountain and then publish it in an alpine journal. And he picked 100 of these, as the name may give away. And he then eventually went on to publish them as this book, which has kind of achieved a kind of iconic, a kind of cult status in Japan. The book is a favourite of the Crown Prince. And once the Japanese royal family got involved, Japanese people have flocked to this, and there's television programs and there's maps, you know, Japanese maps of mountaineering ranges include many of the well-known mountains of this list. And the list is, you know, entirely subjective. It was his choices, and every mountain has a significance to him, but also to what he perceived as the people who lived in the shadow of those mountains. Hakusan was the mountain that most obsessed him. It's one of Japan's 3 holy mountains, and along with Mount Tate and Mount Fuji, of course. And the way that Japanese culture upholds mountains, it's a way of veneration. It's an obsession which I think in some ways we have gone down that path ourselves in Scotland with our Munros and our Corbetts, and the sheer amount of literature that I've gone over the last couple of months. There are a lot of books on mountains. Luckily I didn't read them all, so I've still got some more time. So yes, with this in mind, with Fuji as kind of the most well-known of the Japanese mountains, and its depiction in poetry and in art and also through the ascents, I wanted to kind of perhaps draw together my own list of mountains, but from a Scottish perspective. And the argument has gone between, should I have a Scottish list or should I have a British list? You know, should I include Ireland? I've spoken to lots of mountaineers who, unsurprisingly, all have different opinions, but I decided to keep it to Scotland because we have quite a few mountains here, as you may have noticed. So, Foucault. In the compilation of his list, he broke it down to these three elements: history, grace, and personality. And as I said, we have Hewitts, Corbetts, we've got humps at height over a measured perspective. I think it's 150 meters. There are so many different classifications of mountains, and the hubris of me coming here and adding another list to that is quite something. But I needed something to begin this list with, kind of an entry point into Scotland's mountains. And while I do respect things like the Munro list, I think this is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Munro. And it's, I think people who do Munros or Corbetts or Hewitts, I've got the utmost respect for you, what you've achieved. And I've met many of you. I've sat down with Hamish Brown recently, which was a bit of an honour for me, and talked about, the kind of people who collect these mountains. But for me, that wasn't kind of my way into it. Not because I don't want to do mountains. I've done many of the Munros, but because I wanted to have a list which kind of came in sort of from the side, as it were. So some of my mountains are Munros, and some of them are quite small in comparison. So, you're sitting there today and you're thinking, what would be an iconic Scottish mountain? We have several. And when I've asked this question to people, I keep getting the same answers. Sutherland comes up quite heavily, or the Herdsman, just outside of Glencoe, or h-Alba, for example. Those ones roll off the tongue. I've heard the Edwin Morgan poem Scots Canadolia, which ends with h-Alba, 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 about 10 times now, but it's always nice to hear it. But when it came to compiling this list, it's a difficult one. And like Foucault, I don't see the list that I'm putting together as definitive. It's not one which has an end point. It's one which will probably change as I go through my life, because I haven't climbed all 100 of these mountains. And over the course of my life, I hope to, but I'm going to discover more as I go through these, and perhaps add them, take ones off. Perhaps I've had some pretty bad days on various mountains. Maybe I'll go back again in nicer weather and completely change my view on, Mount Keene. Unlikely. So, one of the great joys during the summer of last year, some of you may remember the summer, we had it for the last 2 days, was working with this collection here, and the maps was always the win for me. My father was military and worked with mapping, so to work with the maps collection here was really a privilege. And examples such as this, kind of laid out for me why perhaps, kind of what way I could get into this. So yeah, with here this Thomas Moole illustration from the Principal Hills in Great Britain from 1837. I'm going to actually blow your minds this afternoon. I don't know if any of you can read this. I mean, the exciting thing is just off the map here. This is the highest mountain in Britain, just slightly hidden off there to the side, which I believe is Ben Macdui at that stage. But it's changed in height a little bit. No, it's not changed in height. We've changed our measuring. But the actual true shocking element this evening, the fact it's been covered for years, the thing which is going to change your view of the world today is this mountain here. This is Ronas Hill in Shetland. I don't know if there was a pretty raucous uphellia or what happened, but this 4,000-foot beast has gone down to about 400 meters. So I don't know what's happened there. It's quite interesting to look through these old maps and find things like this. I actually discovered an interesting word, which is Mount Weasel. And this is a Mount Weasel, potentially. And that's, I think the term comes from the 1960s. It's like in mapping when they put in a fake item in a map. Well, there was an Elizabeth Mount Weasel, I believe, who was a fake person put into like an encyclopedia of people. And I wonder if Ronas Hill has appeared in other places from lazy cartographers or lazy map producers. So yeah, an interesting one. But again, it's been a real privilege to look through collections such as this. I'm sure you've all seen this Lazar etching, which again shows the principal heights and mountains. And you can see just from this illustration, we have some fairly impressive peaks in this country. We have the kind of the Sgurr, the kind of more the pointed peaks, and then we have some of the more rounded peaks of the Cairngorms, and of course Ben Nevis up here. So I'm really enjoying using this laser pointer. You can see I'm sort of like a child. Put it away. But yeah, you can see here we even have Ailsa Craig down here, which is, I grew up in Ayrshire, so having something like that as a reference point was great. And to actually see these in person, if you get the chance to go to the map collection, do actually sit with these. The amount of detail which has gone into these, and the fact that they're actually hand-coloured, having sat with several editions of this and seeing how each one varies slightly was quite wonderful. So, when I say iconic mountains of Scotland, this one tends to come up constantly, and it's for obvious reasons. My background is I did an undergraduate degree in art history, so when I studied at Glasgow, I had an obsession with mountains even at that stage and tried to get that into my dissertation. And this is one artist that I was fairly obsessed with, which is Reinhard Behrens. He took Scottish mountains, included them in this kind of imagined world called Naboland. And I just love the fact that he took one of Scotland's most iconic mountains and then transposed it into this imagined world. And that's one of the great things about artists, and that's one good thing I've enjoyed about this project, is kind of looking at that intersection between the artist and the mountain. And having the chance to have a look through collections and archives has been wonderful, just kind of seeing the mountains that I've chosen, how they've been depicted. And some mountains I've chosen on this list because they've been depicted in a certain way. There's some mountains I couldn't avoid including in this list, and this is one of them. I think if I didn't include the herdsman amongst this list, I think people would have been very upset with me. So I decided to avoid that one by including it. Again, everyone has an opinion of which mountains should be in this, this list. And a very enthusiastic member of the mapping team said I should include the Eildon Hills. And you know, they're interesting. They have a personality to them, but perhaps for the purposes of this, I've had to break some hearts by not including certain mountains in this list. And if anyone wants to speak to me afterwards and tell me about the mountains that you want included, I will lie to you and say that I have included your favourite mountain. But I'm not going to reveal the full list today. That's what sells books. No, that's I'll show you some of them, but feel free to ask me later. But yeah, this Turner image is fantastic. It just shows that the romantic take on the landscape, and in terms of his expressive watercolours really do kind of, they slightly elevate perspectives and show Melrose in a sort of different light, but I don't think we go to Turner's images really to get a accurate photographic type image of the landscape before us. So, mountains. This was really one of the first mountains I ever really went up, was the Cobbler, and it's one that many people in the Central Belt first went up. It's a Corbett, of course. It doesn't quite reach the lofty heights of Monrodom, but it's iconic all the same. When I first came to Scotland in the very late 1980s, this was one of my first memories of Scotland. I arrived by boat and drove round to Dunoon, to Argyll, where my family are from, and I just remember seeing the Cobbler, you know, rearing up behind Arachar. And for years and years, I was kind of told these horror stories by uncles and so on that, oh, you don't go near the Cobbler, you know, it's a killer mountain, a killer mountain. I grew up with this kind of view that the mountains were dangerous, forbidding places, foreboding. You know, I sounded like I was being told things which sounded like 19th century authors, you know, or 18th century. You know, Defoe saying they're frightful places. Well, I was taught that the mountains were frightful places from an early age, and no more such than the Cobbler. But having been up there and threaded the needle, it's on a nice day. It wasn't so challenging, but that's, again, it wasn't windy, it wasn't in the middle of snow, so yeah, my experience was quite a calm one. So as I said, I've discarded other people's favourites, but I'm going to include my own because that's the great joy of putting together a list, and it's what Foucault did as well. His rules of grace, of elegance, of history and culture for inclusion in the list also had one other element. Every mountain on his list had to be at least 1,500 metres tall. So this is the shortest list ever because Scotland's highest mountain is just over 1,000 metres. So I can't stick too close to that list or yeah, this would be the shortest talk ever. So no, instead I've decided to pick mountains which do tick those iconic boxes, but also that mean something to me as well. And Foucault did the same. So I'm taking that template and just ever so slightly altering it. So I took this image about 2 weeks ago in the Scottish winter, near where I live, near Seamill in North Ayrshire. And this is the view that I kind of grew up with. And Foucault often talks that there's nothing better in life, nothing more fulfilling than the view of one's own mountain. Because Japanese people each grew up in the shadow of their own mountain. Each mountain was tied inexorably to a village or to a home place. And for me, I'd say that Goat Fell and that range are really the mountains of home for me. So, you know, when I travel, quite often I think about this landscape and I don't feel settled when I come back to Scotland until I see that vista. And today I didn't see that vista because it was hidden behind, you know, so much mist. But it's great actually being in Ayrshire because it's different every day. Yeah, I think I've seen it for days now. But anyway, so this range of mountains, it's kind of a good one to talk about because the Isle of Arran being so close to Glasgow and Edinburgh, it's been so heavily depicted by artists because it was quite a straightforward boat journey from the mainland to get over there. And consequently, it's a place which has been used for experimentation by artists, by early photographers, and I'll just talk through some of that and why it's kind of an important place. So yeah, you can see here we have George Washington Wilson's take on those, yes, what he called the cyclopean walls of the Stackich Ridge. And Goat Fell itself, which this is kind of leading to North Goat Fell, I believe, this was one of the first mountains I ever really went up, and that was in snow and terrible weather with my father. And that kind of stuck with me at an early age. I've kind of grown to love these places. In life, it's somewhere I've always gone back to just for some quiet and respite. And I can't tell you how many times I've been up Goat Fell, but it's probably over about 40. Maybe I should start choosing different mountains to go up. But George Washington Wilson, this is one of the archetypical sites of the kind of Highlands, as it were. This George Washington Wilson's production of postcards, these romantic images, went all over the world, and it was mountains that kind of really drove a lot of that. And yeah, one of my favourite views. One of the interesting things, though, about Arran, and this was an image made by John Muir Wood, who I guess today we'd I don't know how you describe him. I mean, imagine a world where we didn't have social media or Netflix or television or the internet. You'd actually get things done. Well, this is someone who actually got things done. He was a piano maker. He collected music. He was an amateur photographer at the very birth of photography. And he's someone who's not become a household name, but as someone obsessed with photography as well, I'm doing a doctorate in it at the moment, I feel that he should be better known in Scotland. And the last exhibition we had of his work, I believe, was in 1988. So it'd be nice to see him come back in vogue again. But this was an image he made using the calotype process, which was the first photographic process which could be reproduced. And they're made on kind of thin tissue-like paper, salt prints. And this was an image just listed in the National Galleries as Arran. Again, my obsession all those times climbing up Goat Fell means that I know this is Ben Nus here and Ben Tarswin in the background. And he travelled to Fairley, which is just across from Arran, and there was a large group of photographers who worked there and travelled out to Arran. So Arran sort of becomes this place where a lot of things are tested photographically. And these are the kind of ways in with this project I want to talk about. I want to take a mountain, I want to look at the way it's been kind of depicted or how people have interacted with it, how they've written about it, talked about it, written songs, poems. And with this range, I could just do a book called Mountains of Arran, and it would probably be quite a long one. D.Y. Cameron. So again, for me, this was an artist who kind of inspired me as a photographer. These kind of dark images that Cameron produced are kind of iconic. He embarked on this huge project to depict the Highlands in the 1920s and travelled around the north all over and had these kind of jewel-like or kind of murky imagery, which kind of tied in very much with the time. He's very well known for railway posters, for example. But yeah, Sir David Young Cameron's images, again, this is looking Ciar Mhor, which has now appeared, what, 4 times in this talk. This is a view that he interpreted quite differently to the artists who came before him. And and this is another image of the same mountain, Ciar Mhor. And this is the problem that I've had with this project, is I can pick a mountain and then look up every way that people have interacted with it. And it's colossal, the amounts of time, the amount of information produced just by that. If I did research on Ciar Mhor or Goat Fell or any of those ranges, those mountains and those ranges, I could just talk endlessly about the very different ways in which they've been produced. I do quite like this image because you'll notice it's done in a Japanese woodblock kind of way. It's done in 1946, so taking this very Japanese aesthetic just after the Second World War. It's quite interesting. And this is another artist who I feel has been somewhat overlooked. His kind of Edo period approach to the Scottish landscape is quite interesting, and I would recommend you to look at more of Ian Shane's work. And finally, with this range, this is the work of another young artist. So the islands still continue to draw people in. This is Robin McGilvery, and this is, again, Ciar Mhor and Castleavale. If there are any Gaelic speakers here, I'm really sorry. I'm trying to improve my Gaelic. And this is a work that she produced last year as part of her degree show. And when I spoke to her about what drew her into the mountains, it was the same reason that drew me in. It's getting away from switching off your technology, walking into the hills, and just experiencing something else. And she wasn't familiar with the work of those other artists that I've just mentioned, who'd sat on the same saddles or sat on the same peaks and the same valleys. And to see her, when she knew her work was in that context, it was quite enriching and quite interesting that, having not seen those images before, that she decided to choose in the same vistas. So we're kind of drawn to certain views. So we're away from Aaron now. This project's been an interesting one because I've spent so long going through the records and looking through a lot of visual material, looking through my own notes, through traveling around Scotland and going up some of these things, and trying to decide what makes an iconic mountain. What kind of builds something what makes it so important to me that others might be interested in it as well. Should I be a contrarian and just pick mountains that people just don't know the names of, or should I just pick all the Gaelic named mountains that people might struggle to pronounce? That would be monstrous. Or should I pick ones that perhaps intersect with all these things? And this is one here. This mountain, Lunavane, sometimes referred to by people whose Gaelic is not perfect as Looney Bin, is really one of those mountains. It's something when you approach from Inverurie, it just towers above you. It's the name, I think Irvin Butterfield said the name refers to the great sea-swelling wave. And when you stand below it, you can see it looks like this towering wave. And it kind of, and to my mind, it kind of brought in ideas of Hokusai and the great wave over Kanagawa. But that could be because I have a Japanese obsession at this moment in time. But as a mountain, it has quite a distinctive shape to it, quite distinctive form. It stands out amongst its kind of the company of mountains it keeps, and with Larvin near to it, standing proud. It's kind of again, it's one of those peaks which I couldn't not include within this. But then that kind of raises an interesting dilemma for me, because it's a mountain which has form and grace in my eye. Because this is all about aesthetics in some ways, but there are other kind of intersections as well, like what's its appearance in poetry, and has it been covered in songs perhaps of that area, or in artistic depictions. So for me, it's been an interesting process of then looking at a mountain that I think may be quite attractive, for under certain kind of attributes, and then working backwards to see then, is it important, does it fit Thucada's criteria? So, during the summer, I decided to pick a mountain that I know and love and that I wanted to include on this list and revisit it to see, perhaps, I wanted to test myself and see, is this one that I should include within the list? And the Merrick was one that I've long loved, where I grew up in North Ayrshire, so I could see the Merrick. It's in the range of the Awful Hand, which sounds like a Nick Cave song. But it's an impressive mountain in its own right, but it's one which perhaps doesn't have the same immediate appeal as something like the Herdsman or h-Alba. You know, it's kind of a slow burner, you know, and it can only be viewed in that kind of great dome shape from like Loch Enoch nearby. But it's not a mountain that perhaps immediately people would think of. And there's a wonderful book written in the 1950s called Portrait of Mountains, which takes one of this mountain's sister mountains, Corcoran, and posits that it's an important mountain for Scotland, that it should be included in this kind of great pantheon of Scottish mountains. And I decided instead that the Merrick perhaps should be one. Many of you, I'm sure, have been up the Merrick again. It's like the Arrochar Alps. It's close to Glasgow, and it's one that many people go up. It's one of the first mountains a lot of my friends have been up. And it's the highest mountain in lowland Scotland, south of the more well-known mountains. And it's one which I kind of, again, it has an interesting feature in shape and form. It has, again, a slow reveal as you approach it. You approach via Ben Yellery, and then you go along this long spine to reach the top of it. And I took my partner with me during the summer. I don't think she enjoyed this mountain very much. But this is my list. So, so I mean, looking at the prominence of the Merrick in literature then was one of my first approaches, and it appears in Crockett's The Raiders. That's this whole area. Loch Enoch, which sits at its base, looking towards it, was used for, the sand there was so coarse, they used it for scythes. That's an industry which sadly is no longer with us. And the entire area around it is quite fascinating in terms of wilderness space, because we don't expect this part of Scotland to be so quiet, so remote. But having walked into the interior here, there's definitely a feeling of remoteness. And it's a place where some of the last shepherds in this lowland area kind of worked. There's a very moving kind of monument to a shepherd who was lost in the protection of his sheep during a snowy winter near one of the bothies, which is out here. And this is the kind of thing I want to bring into this project, is kind of looking at mountains from lots of different perspectives, from those who worked the land to those who painted, and again, those who wrote prose and fiction around them. Because the thing with this project is I just don't want to have a one-sided view of mountains, which just brings in perhaps like a landed gentry view of Scotland or a Victorian view of Scotland, which kind of just, you know, reduces our mountains down to biscuit tin images. I want to have kind of a more nuanced look. And starting with this list has been great for that, but it's also been a complete nightmare because we, again, have so many hills and mountains to choose from. So here's another one that's on the list. This is the Clisham, Grand Clisham, up on Lewis. Sorry, actually in Harris. I'm sorry if there's any Herricks in here that I've just inadvertently offended. I moved to the Outer Hebrides for 2 years to work as a curator at Saltire. And as is quite often the way, I arrived on the island, and one of the first things I had to do was to get a better view of the island, and where better to go than up to its highest point. And I chose one of the worst days of the year to go up there. It started off nicely, and then the weather just quite quickly descended into bad wind and rain and storm. And when I wrote to my partner, who's in Australia at that time, and told her what I was doing, I don't think she was very impressed, but that's how I roll, as they say. And this mountain was one which perhaps, again, has a different approach to it than perhaps a more central belt-based mountain, because there's not a lot of painted depictions of the Clisham. But it does appear in poetry, for example. But it's undoubtedly it's an important mountain in the Outer Hebrides. It's the highest point. From Stornoway, you can see it it takes up it's forever on the horizon. On Harris, it kind of dominates. It's a mountain which has this kind of, you can see the deer grass here. It's constantly changing, and the weather's constantly changing. And it's one that gave me such a different perspective on the islands. And from coming up here, I told you the weather was terrible, but then it cleared, and I could see as far as St Kilda out to the west, and then down the rest of the range, and it just gave me this most wonderful kind of view of the island chain. Seaton Gordon came up the Clisham, and I think his experience was much the same as Hamish Brown, who also went up the Clisham. Noting that not a lot of bird life there. It's quite a quiet mountain, or it feels quite a quiet mountain in comparison. to many of the others that have been up. But it's a fascinating place, and this is something which, over the course of the research was kind of answered for me, because I wondered, why are there all these buildings, these kind of small structures on the top of Clisham? What are all these kind of little places? I thought, did someone stay up here? Are people mad? And it turned out this was part of the great. You can see here on the left, back to the laser pointer. You can see here these are the remains of observation stations which were put up on the top of the Clisham to measure distance to other points across the island chain as part of this great mapping which happened across the UK. Very much worth reading Rachel Hewitt's book, Map of a Nation, if you haven't already, which kind of talks about this. And these stations, such as one up here, I've got a lot of admiration for the men who spent 3 months, I believe, working up there. But even more admiration to the man who lived at the bottom of the mountain who brought them up food at a somewhat extortionate rate. But yeah, the Clisham is, to the people of the Outer Hebrides, it's an important mountain. When I expressed that I was interested in mountains, people were like, oh, have you been up to the Clisham? And it's one that, I have very fond memories of going up there. So since I'm talking about mapping, other ways in, this is Paul Sandby's, just a general image of mountainous terrain. Sandby was one of the early, he accompanied the map making and ordnance survey teams and depicted what was going on there. I think, was it 10, 15 years, very soon after the clearances, not the clearances, sorry, 45. And he travelled around the Highlands depicting what these teams were doing. And Sandby's an interesting one because he, as kind of one of these military illustrators, his work is fascinating in what he shows and what he doesn't show. I think one of the most well-known images that Sandby produced was of Schiehallion, or not of Schiehallion. He turned to stand at the end of Loch Rannoch and to turn your back on Schiehallion and illustrate what's in front of you rather than behind you. Seems a bit hubristic, but perhaps that was the issue. For these mapping teams to go up into the Highlands and then to measure the heights and distances to depict these places in Scotland would probably feel quite hubristic, with Schiehallion towering above these tiny figures, carrying out their measurements. So Sandby's an interesting one from that, and he's part of a great tradition of other artists who travelled through with that kind of London-centric kind of mapping cartographic background. I'll come on to those in a minute. So for myself, my interest in Scotland's mountains, apart from going up, Goat Fell at a young age, was actually through art as well. And John Knox, to my mind, is one of the great Scottish artists. Again, someone who came after Naismith. His work depicting Highland landscapes is, it's an important kind of step, kind of evolution in the kind of way we view Scotland, and I'll explain why in a second. But it's very much worth seeking out on the National Gallery's website his original drawings and sketches which he made in the Highlands, because the thing I really admire about John Knox is that he actually painted from mountain tops, or he did his sketches from mountain tops, I should say. He actually got into the landscape and wanted to show them in a way that he experienced them. And this is an interesting one, this John Knox landscape, it ties into those ideas of the romantic landscape. We see Loch Katrine here with tourists. You see a man here with a very early prototype of a selfie stick, which is interesting to see that as an artist he was so forward-thinking. Knox himself created these mountainscapes of great grandeur with Ben Ledy and so on around there. Again, inspired tourists to come in their great numbers to Scotland. And already, in the 1830s, we have a certain view of Scotland going out, which is very much influenced by, antiquarian ideas, very much of a kind of a romanticised Scotland, which comes along in great effect soon with, Water Scotland. So again, Knox is the kind of, Knox and Naismith are the great forerunners to Horatio McCulloch, a name which, sorry for the quality of this image, an artist who came to define Scottish landscape painting really in kind of the mid to late 1800s. And his kind of, his images can still be found today, you know, in the kind of the shortbread tin depictions of Scotland, but that's taking away from what he actually achieved. He was very much an artist of his time, although he, you know, he developed his own style, but he wanted to depict the silences, I believe. He wanted to show the great silences of the highlands, of those places, and the deer, which is how he put it. And this was the kind of his mantra throughout life. He wanted to communicate to the viewer these spaces best. And you can see again the figures here, as they were in Knox before. See, not on this one. Again, very much an element of romantic art. It places the figure into the landscape, allows them to get a sense of scale and to kind of get an idea of you know, what it's like to be within those places. And yeah, McCulloch again, his work very much does that. It sort of came to define even modern day Scotland, how we view much of the Highlands, this kind of other. And just to show you a photographic example, yeah, this is James Craig Annan's The Dark Mountains, believed to be Ben Vorlich. I believe it's actually shot on Stucha Croin, apologies for the pronunciation, looking over, as opposed to Ben Vorlich in near Loch Lomond. There's been some debate about this, but I think it's been settled once and for all that this is the easterly Ben Vorlich. But you can see, again, the romantic ideal of from the German, the Rücken figure, the artist, the people in the landscape with their back to admiring the sublime, the awesome view in front of them. And again, it's this romantic view of Scotland which perpetuates. And as I go into each mountain, I'll be talking about perhaps, you know, the day that this image was made and how that was achieved, and how we subsequently have come to view some of these places. So we're back to Turner again. Again, Turner, as I said earlier, this is the Loch Carusk on Skye from 1831, for those who can't read at the bottom there. And it's frontispiece to Robert Cadell's edition of Scott's Lord of the Isles. And again, this image is held in the National Galleries. It's quite small, it's a watercolour, but if you get the chance to see it, it's very jewel-like in real life. It's kind of wonderful, kind of draws you in. And this place, Loch Carusk, which Scott called that dread loch, in typical Scott style, is, you can probably tell I'm not a huge fan of Sir Walter Scott, but I'm trying to get there. I heard it comes with age, so so if anyone has any, you know, advice on that, please help. But I've been quite interested in the depictions of the Cuillins and Skye in particular. Before I lived on Lewis and Harris, I actually spent close to a year living in the south of Skye, working for Solmor Ostig as the artist in residence. And it was a great year. I had the chance to, basically I would climb during the day and take my camera with me, which was a large Victorian box camera, and drag them up various hills and places. And it gave me a different perspective, no pun intended, on these mountain ranges. And one thing we always see in depictions of the Cuillin is the view from what we're standing on, which is, I believe in this image, is Sgurnastree, which is the mountain of strife. And Sgurnastree itself it's a mountain, a very small mountain. I think it's only about just under 500 metres high, which you can see from Elgall. It kind of rises up again in that familiar pyramidal form. And it's a mountain which normally gets overlooked as part of that range because, you know, you've got the Cuillin Mountains around you. You're going to naturally find yourself somewhat written out of history. But Sgurnastree is an amazing viewpoint, and this is where Turner made his way up to, and many artists subsequently did, myself with all my camera gear and development kits, chemicals, a small tent to develop the images in on the top of the hill. The Mountain of Strife name did actually become apt for me that day. But this viewpoint, as you can see here, yes, it's overblown, it's in that Turner-esque way, but it does show the kind of the intensity of feeling and drama which he tried to convey to audiences. And to me, it's a much more interesting or a different take than this, you know, Sir David Murray work, which comes, you know, after McCulloch and so on, which shows the kind of gold and kind of last light of the day of Loch Carusk here. You can see the loch here, and this is the entrance point. Very dramatic, overblown Victorian image. I could have just done a book called The Mountains of Scotland, as seen by Victorian artists. But I'm not sure how many people would want to read that book. Personally, it's an interesting image, but again, it doesn't have the connection perhaps of the other one. For me personally, again, it's about aesthetics. And this is what I was doing. This is taken from Brook na Free, and my partner came up with me on this hill. She did enjoy this one. This was in July, and we were in t-shirts. It's so hot, so warm. And this image was made facing the peak of the young men, or the peak of the lads, as it's sometimes translated as. And yeah, July, snow in the mountains. And it's interesting, this image was just made a couple of years ago. And having conversed with various people who are interested in weather systems in Scotland and how the snow lies, it's been interesting to see how little snow there is this February. People, saying that, our Ben Nevis, for example, has as little snow now, like it's compared to like July levels in previous years, which is quite worrying. And that's one thing which this research has thrown up, which has been quite interesting, is Paula mentioned earlier, Graham Brown. He was an avid photographer, and of the Brenva approach, up the Brenva face of Mont Blanc, he took so many images of the Brenva face. He talked about the condition of the snow. He talked about the different layout of the snow on the mountain. And that might seem at the time probably quite pedantic to people, but it's actually become an invaluable resource today, because we can now see the changes. It's the same when we look at glaciers across the world. When we look at antique imagery, we can see that just the changes that with climate change has brought about from our mountains. I mean, this image is only, a couple of years old. I don't think it's going to be used for anything, but it's interesting to see the kind of shifts. And for me, this was part of this project, these 100 mountains, is to kind of get a bit closer to the mountains, to kind of understand them. And in this one, it was an exercise to see how early Victorian photographers really kind of got their teeth into mountains. How Francis Frith or people from those early photographic studios got up in mountains and made images. And for me, it was quite an exercise to do this, to kind of to tell a more interesting story about each peak. Is that for Cara again? The other thing with this project is also looking at the different ways in which the landscapes have been depicted. This John McLaughlin-Milne landscape of Sutherland, which was made in the early 1930s, very much shows that kind of Gauguin-esque approach to the landscape. You can see the brightness of the colours, and that's one thing that I've kind of encountered in this project, is the way in which people have approached these mountains. It shows Scotland's interconnectivity with the world. It shows different schools of art coming in. If we just focused on that Victorian painted perspective of the landscape, we would only get one part of the story. And John McLaughlin-Milne's a really interesting one. He did paint on iron, but I thought I'd save you from another image of iron. Show you this one instead. But this take on Sylvan, which I'm sure you all recognise, is, it's quite an interesting one, quite fresh and quite radiant. And I feel like the story of Scotland's mountains has only really been partly told through its artistic depiction. So, Ben Durain from the west face. I thought I'd just show you from a slightly different angle, from below, looking up. There are other ways to look at mountains, and there are other ways to talk about mountains. I've shown you a lot of visual imagery, but that only really tells part of the story. And when it came to putting this project together as a book, it's been interesting, really, because where I said there's been kind of elements which have been missing in the story of images perhaps not made, or paintings which aren't there, or other ways in. This is a mountain which always comes up. And when I meet Gaels or people who speak Gaelic, this is the mountain which always comes up first, because it has such a resonance. Duncan Ban McIntyre's great poem, an ode to Ben Durain, is kind of a heartbreaking long form poem which talks about the changes at the bottom of the valley, of the people who used to live there, and then their eventual clearance and loss. And that's one the mountain sort of stands as witness to these actions. And this has been the most fascinating part of the project, is really getting closer to kind of Gaelic texts and looking at, the different ways in which mountains have been depicted. And as a lowlander, that's been quite interesting, quite eye-opening. Having moved up to Lewis and living on Skye, to have this different perspective, which is oral, has been kind of, it's been quite moving at times to learn of these poems. This is an image of Hannah Taluki I made several years ago for a project she was involved with called Away with the Birds. And quite an ambitious project. She built a floating stage on the Isle of Canna, and then produced a body of work which was inspired by mimesis, so Gaelic bird song. It was completely mad, but completely brilliant at the same time. But she instinctively and immediately wanted to be shot in Glen Etive, because she knows the importance of Glen Etive, as I wish some other people would know at the moment, because they're with hydro schemes going through there. But with this, we wanted to create an image which tied her into the land. And this image, called the Song of Deirdre, which is part of the song cycle she created, ties into Deirdre of the Sorrows, who is part of the great story cycle, apparently how Bower was built in Glen Etive, but also the tie-in with songlines. I mentioned Duncan Ban McIntyre a moment ago. Well, Duncan Ban McIntyre also wrote a songline. For those of you who aren't familiar with songlines, maybe you've heard about them through Tim Winton, the Aboriginal songlines. Well, the way of telling stories about the land through place names, continuing onward as a journey around the valley. Well, Duncan Ban McIntyre wrote a beautiful songline around Glen Etive, which takes you right up and then right back down the valley again. And she knew that she wanted to be part of that. So that's what brought this image around. And many of the mountains around Glen Etive appear in my list, but I'm not going to tell you which ones. So again, to continue with the Gaelic theme, I spent some time down in North Uist, and I wanted to kind of get to know the land a bit better, so I spent about 2 weeks down there. And North Uist is not often a place that people think of going for mountaineering or hill walking expeditions. It's somewhat flat, as you can see here. But this top here, Eval, is on my list, and I'll tell you why. It's only about, I think, is it between 350 and 450 metres high? I can't remember the exact height. But given the relative flatness of Uist, it just looms above everything. It's quite an impressive peak for that. And for those of you who haven't done it, or who haven't been to North Uist, I very much would recommend it. It's a beautiful walk-in, which takes you around Brochs, and it takes you around some interesting lochans. And the final ascent is again 350 metres or so. It's not huge by mountaineering standards, but it's such an important mountain for this place. From the top, you can see this view here. I believe one of the local kind of sayings is, count the lochans before you, and once you reach 100, you should probably give up. I think I got to about 30, and I was like, this is a fool's errand. But the view from up there is incredible, and it's a mountain which is very much tied into the place. It's a mountain which I tried to find more, again, depictions of, and there's plenty of depictions of it by Victorian photographers. Not so many in painters, but it appears very much in a literary tradition. And I just want to read you a poem, not one that I've written, thankfully, but one which ties into the land. Because that's the other aspect of this. Pretty much everything I've shown you has been dominated by men. It's been male painters, male photographers, Duncan Ban McIntyre, male. But there are other ways into mountains. There's being with a mountain, as Nan Shepherd, so beautifully wrote about. Nan Shepherd to me really is up there in our writers. It's a much more, to me, interesting way into the peaks. But there's also this poem, which was written by Mary MacLean of North Uist. And it's as mountains go, it's not a huge one, but it's so important to the people there, and that kind of comes across in her poem. And this is from 1951. She's a bardess from North Uist. She actually won the Poet's Crown at the Mod, which is wonderful, for this poem, which is called To Ben Éval. So, all-enabling spirit of poetry, please come down now to join me. Let me build the poem of my dreams, and I'll praise the high mountain that entranced me in childhood, with her conical cloud-capped face and her gums, with her dark, pitted, sinister face, round which elements roar when the frozen doldrums turn wild. For all the force of erosion each year from the start on you, you remain there, close by the coast. Pitted, steep-sloped and higher you, with your swift-flowing, loud-watered streams that have come from your break to the plain. They've been churned through crevices, and they chatter quietly, descending, till they approach the strand that's below them. Broad, solid, stubborn are you, sitting quietly on the floor of the fair island that stirs me to music. And when May returns with its dew, bringing growth to each floweret, it makes a favour and it crowns you with mist. Did some flaming silver-bright firebolt come with rain from the sky to scar your steep, bridled crags and leave you pockmarked and scratched with a tear in your side that will forever be seen as your wound? Did painful strokes of old age make those big, leering wrinkles seen so clearly through mist on your face and leave you injured and hairless with that hump on your shoulder and that rip on your heathery clothes? But since the creation, through time and people have passed, no difference or change has approached you. And despite the roaring of winds, you don't cringe or complain. Neither wolf time nor doldrums upset you. You, Éval, are now, in this spot, in this universe, where you were fixed early on in your youth. Until the end comes from high and the bright sun's extinguished, there you'll be, in your accustomed place. So I think that's quite a beautiful kind of description, showing someone's love for this mountain on their land, in their landscape, and kind of going into this project, just taking Éval as a starting point, a mountain which, a lot of people might overlook, but has such a great cultural relevance to the people of North Uist in the way that, say, Benmore, perhaps down in South Uist, does. It's been quite fascinating. It's kind of opened up a different way of looking at mountains for me. When I first became obsessed with mountains, it was really all about the vistas, about those great grand views, about getting up into the mountains and actually conquering them, which is, a view which seems horrendous now as I'm in my 30s. No one conquers a mountain. That's quite an arrogant, mountains allow you to be upon them. I'm not into hiking as an idea, and that's something that John Muir spoke about as well. And he said, I don't like either the word or the thing, hiking. People ought to saunter in the mountains, not hike. Do you know the origin of that word, saunter? It's a beautiful word. Way back in the Middle Ages, people used to go on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. And when people in the villages through which they passed asked where they were going, they would reply, à la Santerre, to the Holy Land. And so they became known as saunterers or saunterers. Now these mountains are our Holy Land, and we ought to saunter through them reverently, not hike through them. It's quite a lovely, take on our relationship with mountains. And it's, it's something that I balance the kind of John Muir's approach and the Nan Shepherd kind of quietly being with mountains, along with kind of the wonderful writers of Scottish mountaineering, Bill Murray or, again, Hamish Brown or, any of these, canonical kind of writers about the landscape. And it's been such a difficult project because it's, trying to distill it down to this list. I must have about 30 versions of this list now, and if any of you want to speak to me afterwards, I'm probably going to have about 60 versions of this list. But it's been a fascinating project, and it's one that I'm continuing online. You can follow it. I've set up a website called 100 Mountains of Scotland, which is to encourage me to continue with this project, and I'll put up small stories, small one-offs about each mountain. I'll put up one about the Merrick shortly, about revisiting it and my own experiences with that in the next couple of weeks. And hopefully some of you might want to follow me on that. And if any of you have favourite mountains or places which mean something to you, or perhaps there's an overlooked writer or artist or poet, one that perhaps you think should have more attention drawn to them, please write to me. Just get in touch and tell me about them. Or tell me why I'm completely wrong. It's like, turn your back on everyone and get rid of that mountain from that list. You know, had the worst day of my life on that hill. I'm interested in all opinions, you know. I mean, I might not use them, but I'm always interested in hearing them. But yes, I just wanted to thank you very much for coming today. And, you know, if any of you want to speak to me afterwards, I'd love to hear your opinions and chat to you then. Thank you.